If you love Elvis, odds are you've been to Graceland. You've taken a tour of the King's airplanes on display there, the Lisa Marie and the Hound Dog too. But did you ever even know this Elvis jet existed?
Nobody had stepped inside Elvis Presley's private jet for 48 years. The aircraft slowly decayed under the New Mexico sun, untouched since Elvis was still alive. Most people thought there was nothing left to see. Then the doors opened.
We wanted to show the world this thing because whenever you see the inside of it, it is phenomenal. And we haven't touched it. All we've done is vacuumed it, wiped it down. That's it. The outside, and that's the original color that it was.
What investigators and visitors found inside looked less like an abandoned airplane and more like a forgotten shrine to the king of rock and roll, and secrets hidden inside a jet that Elvis bought just months before his death. The discovery shocked historians and even longtime Elvis fans. Why was this jet left to rot for decades? What was really inside? And how did one of Elvis Presley's most valuable possessions become one of the strangest abandoned relics in American history? The jet nobody knew about. Most Elvis fans can name the Lisa Marie without blinking. The massive Convair 880 that Elvis converted into a flying palace, complete with a bedroom, conference room, and gold-plated bathroom fixtures. Most fans also know about Hound Dog 2, the second Jetstar that carried his band and crew across the country. Both of those planes sit on permanent display at Graceland in Memphis today, roped off behind velvet barriers, visited by thousands of fans every year. But there was a third jet, and almost nobody knew it existed. On December 22, 1976, Elvis Presley walked into a deal that cost him $840,000, equivalent to roughly $4.4 million in today's money. The aircraft was a 1962 Lockheed Jetstar, model L1329, one of the most prestigious private jets ever built. Frank Sinatra had flown one. President Lyndon B. Johnson liked it so much that he nicknamed it Air Force 1.5. The Jetstar was the first dedicated business jet ever produced, the largest in its class, built with 4 rear-mounted engines and a range that made it genuinely intercontinental. Elvis did not buy it as a business decision. He bought it as a gift, partly for himself and partly to share with his father, Vernon Presley. Vernon was often aboard the Jetstar during early flights, and the joint ownership made the aircraft something different from the others in the fleet. It was personal, family. The red velvet interior was designed to Elvis's specific taste, and the gold finish hardware throughout the cabin was pure Graceland style, elevated to 30,000 feet. 8 months after signing the purchase documents, Elvis Presley was dead, and the jet that had barely left the ground in his ownership suddenly had no destination. After Elvis died on August 16, 1977, the Jetstar was sold quickly. Vernon Presley, the man who had co-signed the original purchase agreement, made the call. The aircraft changed hands and eventually found its way to a Saudi Arabian company. And from there, it followed a path that nobody who knew its origin would have predicted. The Roswell International Air Center in New Mexico was once Walker Air Force Base, a strategic air command installation that housed B-52 bombers and KC-135 aircraft during the height of the Cold War. The Air Force abandoned the base in 1967, and the city of Roswell took it over. By the 1970s, it had become one of the largest aircraft storage sites in the world. Hundreds of commercial airliners and executive jets sat on the massive tarmac and taxiways, baking in the dry desert heat of eastern New Mexico. It was determined that the majority of the airplanes that had arrived in Roswell were disassembled and sold for scrap. Wings will be removed. Engines have been removed. After being removed from the cockpit, the instruments were resold. Given that the air in the desert was beneficial for reducing the rate of corrosion, Roswell was an excellent location for temporary storage. On the other hand, several planes switched from being temporary to permanent. In addition, it became a permanent fixture for Elvis's jet. Over the course of nearly 4 decades, the Jetstar aircraft remained parked on the Roswell tarmac. Its 4 engines were taken out of service. There were several components of the cockpit that vanished. As a result of years of exposure to the unrelenting heat of the desert, the outside paint, which had been a striking red and silver scheme, became less vibrant. A number of holes appeared in the fuselage. A flock of birds entered. To a significant extent, however, the inside was preserved since it was shielded from the elements by the sealed walls of the cabin that were sealed. The crimson velvet upholstery was able to be preserved. Despite its gold finish, the hardware maintained its form. Underfoot, the shag carpet continued to be present. The media cabinet contained a cassette deck as well as a VCR player that were still present. However, the seats continued to swivel. For years, it was an open secret among pilots passing through the airfield that the red jet parked at the far edge of the tarmac had once belonged to the king of rock and roll. Nobody bothered it, nobody publicized it. It just sat there, holding everything it had been left with, waiting. What was happening to Elvis in 1977? By 1976, Elvis Presley was not the same person the world had fallen in love with in the 1950s. Back then, he was energetic, confident, and full of life on stage. But by his early 40s, things had changed a lot. He was still famous, still performing, still drawing huge crowds, but behind the scenes, he was struggling. His body was worn down from years of non-stop touring. His schedule had been intense for a long time, and there were very few real breaks. Traveling, performing, late nights, and pressure from fans and management had slowly built up until his body could no longer keep up the same way it used to. Over time, he began relying on prescription medication just to get through the day. This didn't happen suddenly. It developed slowly as a way to deal with exhaustion, pain, and stress. But it also made things harder in the long run. At the center of Elvis's professional life was his manager, Colonel Tom Parker. Parker was one of the most powerful people in Elvis's world. He controlled bookings, contracts, and most of the decisions around Elvis's career. But Parker himself was a complicated figure. He was not originally from the United States. He was born in the Netherlands and later built a new identity in America. Because of his personal situation and fears about legal problems, Parker avoided international travel completely. That might sound small, but it had a huge impact on Elvis's career. Even though fans in places like Europe and Japan desperately wanted to see Elvis live, he never performed outside North America. Not once. This wasn't because there was no demand. It was because Parker refused to take the risk of leaving the country. So instead of expanding globally, Elvis kept performing in the United States over and over again. And that's where the pressure really built up. From 1969 to 1977, Elvis performed hundreds of shows in Las Vegas alone. There were times when he would perform 2 shows in a single day, night after night, for long stretches. Imagine doing a full concert, finishing late, barely resting, and then doing it all again the next day. That was his life for years. By 1977, people close to him could see he was struggling. He was still going on stage, still singing, still giving moments of brilliance. But between those moments, there was exhaustion. Deep exhaustion. At his final concert in Indiana, people around him later said he admitted his body was in pain. Even so, he still performed. He felt he had to. There were contracts, responsibilities, and financial pressures that made it difficult for him to simply stop. The financial side of things was also complicated. Over the years, reports suggest that Colonel Parker took a very large share of Elvis's earnings. The exact numbers are debated, but what most accounts agree on is that Elvis did not have full control over his money or decisions. That kind of imbalance can trap someone in a situation where stepping away feels impossible. There were also people trying to help him. His ex-wife, Priscilla Presley, reportedly encouraged him to take a break and get medical support. According to people close to the situation, Elvis agreed that he needed time off. But in reality, that break never happened. Things kept moving. The schedule didn't stop. And this is the world he was living in when something unusual happened in 1976. Elvis bought a private jet called a Lockheed Jetstar. On the surface, it might sound like just another expensive celebrity purchase, but in reality, it was something more personal than that. The jet gave him a sense of control in a life where most things were controlled by others. It was a way to travel privately, without the chaos of commercial airports or constant public attention. He even shared ownership of the jet with his father, Vernon Presley. That detail matters because it shows this wasn't just about luxury. It was also about family and stability. In a time when everything around him felt unstable, this was something he could point to as his. The jet cost $840,000 at the time, which would be more than $4 million today when adjusted for inflation. It was a serious purchase, not a small one. But Elvis didn't get much time with it. In August 1977, he died suddenly at Graceland at just 42 years old. After his death, many of his belongings, including the jet, were no longer part of his life story in a meaningful way. The aircraft was sold and passed on, and over time, it stopped being connected to his name in any active sense. Then, it disappeared into obscurity. For almost 40 years, the Jetstar sat in Roswell, New Mexico. It wasn't in a museum. It wasn't restored. It wasn't protected like a famous artifact. It was just left there in the desert, slowly aging under the sun. Paint faded. Materials broke down. Dust and heat did their work year after year. Most people didn't even know it was there. It was almost like the jet had been forgotten by time itself. Then, in 2017, it reappeared in a small way when it was sold at an auction for about $430,000. That sounds like a lot, but in comparison to its history and original value, it was surprisingly low. Even after that sale, the jet didn't really change its situation. It stayed where it was, still grounded, still unused. Then came 2023, and things shifted again. On what would have been Elvis Presley's 88th birthday, the Jetstar was listed at a major collector auction in Florida. The timing wasn't accidental. It added emotional weight to the moment. Priscilla Presley was there in person. She reminded the audience that Elvis loved flying and that this jet had once been part of his life. That made the room feel different. This wasn't just an old aircraft anymore. It was tied to someone people still deeply cared about. The bidding started and moved quickly. A collector and YouTube creator named James Webb eventually won it for $260,000. That's actually less than what Elvis originally paid decades earlier, which shows how much the jet had changed in perceived value over time. But buying it was only the beginning of the real challenge. Once Webb took ownership, experts were brought in to examine the aircraft. The results were not encouraging. The jet was far too damaged to fly again. Restoring it would cost millions of dollars, far more than its value as a flying aircraft. The engines alone would be a major problem. Even if they could be replaced, modern aviation rules would make it extremely difficult to return the jet to the sky legally. So flying it again wasn't realistic. That left only one option: transformation. Instead of restoring it as an aircraft, Webb decided to turn the Jetstar into something completely different, a motorhome built from a real private jet. The body of the plane would be placed on a truck chassis and turned into a road vehicle. So instead of flying through the sky, it would travel on highways. That idea divided people. Some thought it was disrespectful, like destroying a piece of history. Others thought it made sense that instead of letting it rot away, the jet would live again in a new form, still moving, still visible, still part of a story. What was actually found inside the cabin? The interior of the Jetstar was not a stripped shell. That is the detail that surprised almost every journalist who covered the auction. Walk through that cabin door in 2023, and the first thing visible was red velvet, covering every seat surface, every wall panel, and the cabin floor in the form of a dense shag carpet. The color had deepened with age. The pile had flattened in places, but it was unmistakably intact. The gold-finish hardware throughout the cabin had dulled but held its shape. 6 plush chairs that could swivel and recline were positioned along the cabin walls. A couch occupied one section of the lounge area. Every piece of furniture was where Elvis had placed it. The galley contained its original Kenmore microwave and beverage dispenser, both relics of 1970s appliance design that would have looked cutting-edge at the time of installation. The entertainment system included a television, an RCA VCR player, and an audio cassette player. Headphone ports with individual audio controls were built into every seat position. In 1976, this was technology that most people had never seen in a private home, let alone aboard a personal aircraft. At the rear of the cabin, a lavatory and additional storage areas remained intact behind their original doors. The cockpit, while stripped of some instrumentation, still had working lighting in the instrument panels. Landing lights, taxi lights, and beacon lights all functioned when Webb tested them during his initial inspection. Here is the detail that lands hardest. The original aircraft security agreement, signed by both Elvis Presley and Vernon Presley, was included with the sale documentation. A letter written by Priscilla Presley was also part of the accompanying materials. In it, she wrote that the Jetstar was the only jet Elvis bought with his father, and that Elvis always wished to support Vernon's entrepreneurial dreams, especially after the early loss of his mother. That letter reframes the aircraft from a status symbol into something far more intimate. This was not just a jet. It was a son trying to do something good for his father during a period when almost everything else was collapsing. This is the chapter that competitor videos either ignore or treat too lightly, and it is the chapter that makes the abandoned jet feel genuinely haunting. Elvis bought the Jetstar on December 22, 1976. He died on August 16, 1977. That is 237 days. In those 237 days, Elvis completed multiple grueling concert tours, continued performing in Las Vegas, and, according to multiple documented accounts, spent significant time at Graceland in a deteriorating physical and mental state that alarmed the people closest to him. By the summer of 1977, the people who saw him regularly described a man barely recognizable from who he had been even 2 years earlier. He was in physical pain constantly. His immune system was failing repeatedly, producing recurring fevers and flu symptoms that his medical team masked with medication rather than treating the underlying cause. At one concert during that final year, Elvis reportedly had his head dunked in a bucket of ice water backstage between performances to keep him functional enough to continue. Colonel Tom Parker, standing in the wings, was focused entirely on fulfilling the booking contracts. The prescription medication situation had reached a level that multiple people around Elvis tried and failed to address. Dr. George Nicopolis, his personal physician, was later found by investigators to have prescribed Elvis an extraordinary volume of controlled substances in the months before his death. Some accounts describe Elvis as having little genuine control over what he was given and when. The system around him, the management apparatus, the touring machinery, the financial obligations, had a logic of its own that continued functioning even as the person at its center was breaking down. The Jetstar, bought in December, was sold by Vernon in the spring of 1977, less than 6 months after purchase. There is no documented explanation for the decision to sell it so quickly. Elvis had barely flown in it. The aircraft security agreement had only just been signed. The interior design to his personal specifications had only just been finished. Then, it was gone. One possibility that researchers have raised is that the sale reflected financial pressure. Parker was pocketing a massive share of Elvis's earnings, and the exact state of Elvis's personal finances in early 1977 is not fully documented. Another possibility is that the jet became a logistical complexity that neither Elvis nor Vernon had the bandwidth to manage during an already overwhelming period. Whatever the reason, the aircraft that had been purchased as something shared and personal was sold off in the spring while Elvis was already deteriorating, and it never returned to Memphis. The part of the story nobody explains. The Jetstar wasn't the only aircraft linked to Elvis Presley that had a confusing and poorly documented history in his final years. Around 1977, there were also reports of another aircraft deal that went wrong. Some records describe it as a scam or a failed transaction where promises were made, money changed hands, and then things didn't play out the way they were supposed to. At the time, there were even suggestions that investigators looked into parts of it, but the full details were never clearly explained or confirmed in public. What this really shows is something bigger than just one bad deal. In the late 1970s, Elvis's world was not just about music and fame anymore. It was also full of business deals, contracts, managers, and people handling money and decisions for him. That means Elvis was not always directly in control of everything happening around him. When too many people are involved in decisions like that, things can become messy very quickly. Mistakes can happen, and sometimes people can take advantage of the situation. So the Jetstar wasn't just a random luxury purchase. It was part of a life where control was already slipping in different areas. By late 1976, Elvis was also not in good shape physically. People close to him could see it clearly. He was still performing, but it was becoming harder for him. Some performances during that period even made fans worried because he looked tired and unwell. A TV special filmed around 1977 showed this clearly to the public. It made many people realize that Elvis was struggling more than they thought. Behind the scenes, some people close to him believed he should slow down or take a break, but his schedule continued anyway. In that situation, buying a private jet starts to look different. It wasn't just about luxury or showing off. A private jet also means freedom. It means choosing when to travel, avoiding crowds, and having some control in a life where most things are scheduled by other people. For someone like Elvis at that time, that kind of control would have felt very important. The fact that he shared the jet with his father, Vernon Presley, also matters. It shows this wasn't only about money or status, it also had a family connection, something familiar and grounding during a very unstable time in his life. But Elvis didn't get to enjoy it for long. He died in August 1977, just months after buying the jet. After that, the aircraft quickly disappeared from his world. It was sold off and no longer treated as something connected to him in any meaningful way. Then, it ended up in the desert in New Mexico. For almost 40 years, the Jetstar sat in Roswell. No one was flying it. No one was taking care of it properly. Over time, the outside slowly broke down because of the sun, heat, and wind. The paint faded. Parts of the metal weakened. Some pieces were removed. From the outside, it started to look like a forgotten wreck, but the inside told a different story. Because the cabin was closed off, it was protected from a lot of damage. The dry desert air meant there was less moisture, which actually helped slow down things like mold and decay. So while the outside got worse, many parts inside stayed surprisingly intact. The seats were still there. Some of the interior design and fixtures remained. Even small details inside the cabin survived far longer than anyone would expect for something left untouched for decades. This creates a strange difference. From the outside, it looks like something completely destroyed. But from the inside, it feels like a moment in time that was frozen and never finished. Experts who later looked at the jet were surprised by this. They expected everything to be ruined. But the interior was still in much better condition than expected for something left in a desert for so long. Roswell, without meaning to, acted like a kind of natural storage space. The weather destroyed the outside, but helped preserve parts of the inside. So what remains is not just an old plane. It's something split in two. One side shows damage and time passing. The other side still holds a moment from Elvis Presley's life in 1976, almost like it was paused and left waiting. The question that remains unanswered. The Jetstar now exists as a motorhome, converted by James Webb from a flying machine into a rolling monument. Webb described the result as something that brings together nostalgia, mechanical creativity, and historical reverence. One person who saw the finished product described stepping inside as being in a flying Graceland on wheels, which is either a perfect description or a profound contradiction, depending on perspective. The estate of Elvis Presley, managed through the company that controls Graceland and related intellectual property, has never officially acknowledged the Jetstar in the way the Lisa Marie and Hound Dog 2 are acknowledged. Those two aircraft are core parts of the Graceland experience, displayed with interpretation, lighting, and curatorial care. The Jetstar, the third and final jet, the one bought with Vernon, the one sold in haste and abandoned in a desert, remains outside that official narrative. That absence tells its own story. The Jetstar was purchased and sold during the most difficult period of Elvis's life. It exists as a direct physical artifact of those final 8 months, a period that most official Elvis storytelling handles with careful management. The public image of the king is built on charisma, talent, generational impact, and a tragic ending that audiences have been guided to understand as the loss of an irreplaceable artist. The machinery that drove Elvis to his death, the financial exploitation, the forced touring, the prescription medication system, the complete absence of any genuine support structure tends to appear at the edges of that story rather than at its center. The Jetstar, parked in a desert for 40 years before being auctioned twice and converted into a motorhome, is the physical form of what gets pushed to the edges. It is the thing that was bought with hope, sold without ceremony, forgotten without intention, and recovered by a stranger who saw value where the people closest to the story saw none. When the cabin door opened for the first time in decades during the post-auction inspections, the people present described the experience as stepping into a paused moment rather than a dead one. That description is more accurate than it might seem. The Jetstar was not a finished chapter in Elvis's story. It was a chapter that never got written. Bought in December, sold in spring, abandoned in summer, found in winter, preserved by accident, recovered by coincidence. The timeline of the aircraft mirrors the timeline of a life that ended before it was supposed to, and left behind a set of unresolved questions that no official biography has fully answered. The cassette deck in the cabin still worked when Webb first tested it. The instrument lights came on, the seats still swiveled. Whatever was left inside that aircraft during those 40 years in the desert was not the detritus of a finished story. It was the contents of a moment that got interrupted. Every detail found inside the cabin points toward a man who had not finished. Stage outfits scheduled for tours that never happened. A father who co-signed a purchase document and then watched his son be buried 8 months later. A velvet interior chosen for comfort and privacy in a life that had almost none. A price tag that reflected enormous spending from a man whose earnings were being systematically stripped by the person managing his career. The jet did not end up in a desert because nobody cared. It ended up there because the systems that had been extracting value from Elvis Presley for years moved on the moment he was gone. The Lisa Marie and Hound Dog 2 became museum pieces because they served the tourism economy centered on Graceland. The Jetstar, the personal one, the one bought with Vernon, the one sold quickly and quietly in the final months, did not fit that economy. So it sat. 48 years later, what was found inside was not a scandal or a revelation or a conspiracy. What was found was something simpler and more difficult to look at directly. Evidence that one of the most famous men in the history of music spent his final 8 months buying things with hope, losing control of everything around him, and dying before anyone who loved him could stop it. The jet held that whole story inside its red velvet walls, and nobody came to ask what it knew, until a Florida man with a YouTube channel bid $234,000 on Elvis Presley's 88th birthday and drove it out of the desert on a flatbed truck. Elvis Presley did not just leave behind music, he left behind a jet that nobody claimed, sitting in a desert for 40 years, holding the evidence of his final months inside red velvet and gold hardware. The story of that aircraft is the story of everything that went wrong around one of the greatest artists who ever lived. Hit that like button if this opened up something new for you, and subscribe so more stories like this find their way to the screen.